This tank was armed with only a machine gun and a light cannon designed for aircraft, yet it was one of the most numerous armored vehicles in German service when the Panzer divisions swept through Poland in 1939, an event dubbed Blitzkrieg by the Western press. Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. My name's Tom and I am the host of the Tanks of World War II video series. Now in this series, every episode we look at a different tank that was used during World War II, going in roughly chronological order. Right now we're wrapping up our first series, which is on the 1939 German invasion of Poland. So this is episode number 4 and we are looking specifically at the German Panzerkampwagen II, or as we shall call it the rest of the episode simply, Panzer II. Less of a mouthful. Now, as the name Panzer II implies, this is the second of the many German tanks that we will be covering in this series. You'll probably notice that the episodes covering German tanks run a bit longer than some of the other episodes in this series, and now that's due to the German propensity for making many modifications and variants to their tanks, and because German tanks play a very important role in the overall story of World War II. Both the war itself and specifically tank development during the war. With the rise to power of Hitler in 1933, the German military was free to start developing tanks as part of Hitler's rearmament program. As we covered in episode 2 in the series, the first tank they made was the Panzer I. Now this was a light tank influenced by the designs of Sir John Carden and Vivian Lloyd, who were designing stuff for the British firm of Vickers. Now the Panzer I was a light tank, and it was really not much better than the tankettes of the period. It's armed just with 2 machine guns, I mean not much armament. But it was intended as a first step for the fledgling German Panzer Force, giving them a simple and easy to operate vehicle to train and practice with. And it was also intended as a good starting point for German industry to gain experience building armored vehicles. The eventual plan was that the Panzer divisions would be equipped with 2 medium tanks of around 20 tons approximately, one armed with machine guns and a cannon for anti-tank work, the other with machine guns and a large caliber howitzer for support work against infantry, anti-tank guns, and machine gun nests. And these 2 designs would eventually appear as the Panzers III and IV. However, it was realized not long after the Panzer I was introduced that these future vehicles would not be entering production and getting into service for quite a while, and that a better light tank would be needed as a stopgag measure. So in 1934, the Heereswaffenamt put out a request to German industry for a new light tank under the name LAS 100. Now, various designs were submitted, and much to the surprise of Krupp, who was essentially working on an improved version of the Panzer I, the LAS 100 contract did not go to them, but rather to a design by Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, also known as MAN. Now, this is the point where things start to get a little confusing as far as nomenclature, so bear with me here. Now, you may remember from the Panzer I episode that different versions of German tanks generally are designated with the term Ausführung, usually abbreviated as AUSF, AUSF, and then followed with a capital letter. Generally, they go in alphabetical order. So you saw with the Panzer I, there's the Panzer I Officer A and then the Panzer I Officer B. Those are the 2 major variants of the vehicle. With the Panzer II, things get a little more confusing and a little weirder. And that's because the very early production versions are designated as Panzer II Ausf A1 is the very first one, but it's a lowercase a, not the more traditional uppercase. Then there's the lowercase A2 and then an A3. Then there's an Officer B, which is also lowercase, and Officer C, lowercase. Now, none of these were built in particularly large numbers. Total production coming in a little over 200 vehicles combined for these sort of, I don't know if anybody else calls them, I think of them as the lowercase versions. Now, the differences in these early versions mainly have to do with changes to the suspension and engine, which we'll get into in the technical description part of the video. That said, by 1937, all of these different improvements were combined into the Panzer II Ausf A, that's with a capital A, so sort of indicating the first real production version. And production contracts were expanded, this time to the firms of Henschel, Famo, IAG, MEAG, and Wegmann. Now, more improvements would be made over the production run, resulting in the Panzer II Ofs B, again capital B, and Ofs C, capital C, so not to be confused with those early versions, and the Ausf F, Now, these versions would make up the majority of the 1,800 or so Panzer II tanks produced, with production finally of the Panzer F, the Panzer II Offs F, I should say, ending in 1942. Now, you may be asking, what about the Offs D and E, since we went from C to F? Where'd those go? Well, those did exist. I didn't skip them. I just sort of, those are a little different because they're a different model of the Panzer II, in that it sported a different suspension system. And these were intended to be a faster version of the tank that were intended for the German Reich divisions. Now, only a handful of these tanks were built. Also worth mentioning is the Panzer II Offs L, known as the Luches, which is Lynx in German. This was almost a different tank completely. They really radically redesigned the Panzer II, trying to turn it into a dedicated reconnaissance vehicle, or in German terminology, Panzer-Spa-Wagen. About 100 of these were built, and they're quite a bit later in the war, far outside the invasion of Poland period. We're talking more like 1943, 44. Now, for one more little side note, you'll find this German system of designating subvariants confusing sometimes. I'm sorry, but it's only going to get worse. So we go on to the series. Just wait until we get to the British tanks. That's another topic, though. Now that we've gone over the different types of Panzer II tanks, let's dig a little more into the technical side of these vehicles. Before we get into the differences between the variants, there are certain features they all have in common. Now, the Panzer II is a light tank, of course, coming in anywhere from 9 to 12 tons, depending on this particular version. And one side note, in general in the series, I'm not going to give super absolute precise numbers for weight. And the reason for that is, for one thing, a lot of the different secondary sources use different types of ton. There's different tons. There's your metric ton, there's your short ton, your long ton. They're all close, but they're not the same. So sometimes different sources use different types, and it gets a little confusing. Another is that weight can vary depending on the subvariants of vehicles, depending on whether you're talking about something that's coming right off the factory floor, or the difference between something that's fully loaded for combat. So those all can affect how much a vehicle weighs and those figures. So I like to give a range better because a little margin for error, basically. So back to the Panzer II, another thing that they all have in common, the different variants, is a crew of 3, consisting of a driver, a gunner commander, and a loader/radio operator. Now, in most cases, you might assume that the loader radio operator would be in the turret, but that's not the case with the Panzer II. He's sort of scrunched down in the hull behind the driver and is feeding ammo up into the turret. And the turret itself is only really big enough to accommodate the commander. One interesting feature of the turret is that the turret traversing gear could be disengaged, so it had a manual traversing gear if you wanted to turn it around geared-wise. But also there are just a couple of handles in there, and you could disengage that gear and just shift the turret by hand. So it's small enough to do that. Obviously, that's a feature that will not be on later tanks as they very quickly start to get heavier, heavier and heavier. Armament consists of an MG-34 machine gun and a 2-centimeter KWK-30 autocannon. Now, the 2-centimeter gun was based on an anti-aircraft weapon and offered very limited anti-armor capabilities. Later on, a slightly improved version of the gun, the KWK-38, would be used in the Off-F version of the vehicle. Now, this gun was fed from a 10-round clip, which was shorter than the version used on the anti-aircraft gun, just to accommodate the more cramped conditions inside the tank. And the total ammo supply was 180 rounds, divided up into between high explosive and armor piercing. Now, the AP round of the KWK was capable of penetrating about 20 millimeters of armor at 100 meters. That's really not that much different than the anti-tank rifles of the period, and therefore not very good. And of course, any of these figures that I give out on gun penetration, take with a grain of salt. Again, it's sort of like the weight issue. It's pretty common with any World War II era tank gun that different sources will list different penetration figures. The standards used in the different penetration tests from different countries can and did produce different results depending on a slew of factors, including the quality and type of the armor used for the test, the angle the armor was set at, and how they would define a successful penetration. So some countries might say 30% of the projectile had to make it clear through the armor out the other side for it to be successful. Other countries might say 50. So there's lots of different variables that played in to how different countries defined a successful penetration for their testing. So that can really play around with the numbers, and that's why a lot of times I'll try to give an estimate rather than a really hard number on penetration stuff. The German 2-centimeter gun did have two different armor-piercing rounds. There was the standard AP round, and then there was one with the tungsten core. Now in German parlance, tungsten core projectiles were called composite rigid. And those of you familiar with US terminology, it's the same concept as HVAP rounds. Now that said, tungsten core ammo was always in short supply in the German army due to tungsten shortages, pretty much almost unavailable from 1942 onward. And that's because tungsten is a very valuable metal used in industrial machining, and it's almost more valuable in that application than using it up in ammunition. So beware sources that use figures for tungsten core ammo to show the potency of German World War II tank guns. That ammo is generally not what was being used in the field on a regular basis. As to armor protection, the Panzer II was better armored than the Panzer I, but not enough to effectively protect it against the anti-tank weapons of the period. The early models, so all the lowercase versions that were built in limited numbers, and then the production versions, which are the A, B, and C, those versions all had 14 millimeter of armor across the front of the vehicle, roughly. That was found to be inadequate, so they started adding additional armor plate and bolting it onto the vehicle. So they get 20 millimeters of extra armor on the front of the vehicle. You can kind of recognize these because the early versions of the vehicle have the rounded front nose, sort of where covering the transmission on the front of the vehicle there. And as they put on this extra armor, it's flat plate, so it takes on a flat, pointed appearance. So that's a good visual ID tip there if you want to try to figure out different versions from pictures. One of the things to note about armor plate, when you start adding plate on top of other plate, obviously it does increase protection. It's generally considered not as effective, though, as a single piece of armor of the same thickness. So a single piece of 30 millimeter armor is going to be better than a 20 millimeter and a 10 millimeter, or however, of the same thickness if you put them together. However, it still works. Obviously you're adding armor. And we'll see the Germans do that quite a bit with some of their other models as they go through the war, as well as other countries. Now, by 1941, when the OSF version comes into service, which was sort of the last version that was based on the most common suspension, which is that 5-road wheel leaf spring system. At this point, they've increased the base armor to 35 millimeter, so they don't have to add those extra plates anymore. So that's the best armored version there. And then also there's the D and the E, which are that version with the 4 road wheels on torsion bars. That one has about 30 millimeter of armor in the front, so still in the same category. Now, regardless, none of these vehicles are really proof against anything beyond small arms fire and artillery fragments, particularly those earlier variants. Once you're up to 35 millimeter, it's going to give you better protection against, I would say, anti-tank rifle fire, which is probably important on the Eastern Front. But it doesn't really offer you a lot of protection against the common anti-tank guns this vehicle is going to be running up against, whether it be the British 2-pounder or the Soviet 45 millimeter gun. They're still going to be able to destroy this vehicle in normal combat ranges. While the early versions of the vehicle had a less powerful engine, by the time of the OS-A, the capital A one, the one that's actually like the production model, the standard engine for the Panzer II was the Maybach HL62 TRM 6-cylinder petrol engine. Like almost all German tanks, it's a gasoline engine. This engine produced 138 horsepower, giving the vehicle a top speed of about 25 miles an hour on the road. That's for the A, B, C, and F, while the D and E, with the different suspension, had a top speed on road of closer to about 33 miles per hour. Now, off-road speed, of course, was less for all these different variants, and at least one source says that the off-road speed of the D and E was worse than the A, B, C, and F, which is why they went back to that leaf spring suspension for the F after messing around with the torsion bars for D and E. Now, the relatively rare OS-L, the Luches, which was quite a bit later, that one had a different engine, which was higher powered at 180 horsepower. The very early models had a suspension system with 6 small road wheels with a connecting bar running over them, somewhat similar to the system that we saw in the Panzer I. But by the time of the lowercase c, so the last of the sort of prototypey ones, a new suspension system had been introduced, featuring 5 large diameter road wheels, each mounted on a leaf spring. While the very early versions of the vehicle had a less powerful engine, by the time of the OSF-A, the capital A, the standard engine for the Panzer II was the Maybach HL62 TRM 6-cylinder petrol engine. Like almost all German engines, it's a petrol engine, gasoline. Now this engine produced 138 horsepower, giving the vehicle a top speed of about 25 miles an hour on the road, and that's for the A, B, C, and F. For the D and E, which had that sort of different torsion bar suspension, top speed on the roads was a little better, 33 miles an hour roughly. Now off-speed road, of course, was less for both versions. There's at least one source I found that says that the off-road speed for the D and E was actually worse than the A, B, and C, which is why for the F they went back to that earlier version. And of course then there's the OSF-L Luches, which, like we said earlier, it's almost a different tank. It's got a different engine, it's 180 horsepower, so it's got quite a bit more power to it. The very early models had a suspension system with 6 small road wheels with a connecting bar running over them, somewhat similar to the system on the Panzer I. Now, by the time the lowercase c model came along, right before like the sort of main production versions, a new suspension system was introduced, featuring 5 large diameter road wheels, each mounted on a leaf spring with 4 return rollers along the top. Now, as with most German tanks, the drive sprocket was in the front of the vehicle, meaning that the transmission is also in the front of the vehicle, which means you have to run the drive shaft all the way through the length of the vehicle to get the power from the engine up to that transmission. So you have a drive shaft sort of going through the crew compartment. That's another common thing we'll see in German tanks. We'll see it later on in a lot of the American tanks as well. Now, the D and E variants saw a different suspension system that featured 4 large road wheels mounted on torsion bars with no return rollers. Now this system was discontinued, and for the OSF-F, as we said, the older 5 wheels on leaf spring system was retained. And then finally the OSF-L, the Luches, used a suspension system that looked very similar to a lot of other late war German tanks, featuring overlapping interleaved road wheels mounted on torsion bars, sort of what you see on German half-tracks and on the late stuff like Panthers and Tigers and whatnot. Now, however, since the A, B, C, and F made up the vast majority of Panzer II tanks produced, the 5 large road wheel leaf spring system is by far the most common, and that's what you're going to see in most of the pictures. And when people say Panzer II, that's generally what comes to mind. One other technical feature worth mentioning is the introduction of the commander's cupola on the OSF-F. Now, this feature gave the commander a better view of his surroundings while buttoned up, and these cupolas were also retrofitted to some of the earlier models, the A, Bs, and Cs. So don't assume that the presence of a cupola indicates the vehicle is an OSF. It can be an older one that's been upgraded as well. However, if you see one that does not have a cupola, you know that it's not an OSF for sure. So a little ID tip. Now, during the Polish campaign of 1939, the variants of the Panzer II in service were the A, B, C, as well as the D and E, which were designed specifically for the light divisions. Now the Panzer II F and the L, the Luches, those would go into production respectively in 1941 and 1943. However, since we don't have time to return to the Panzer II in later episodes, I'm just going to go ahead and do all the different variants now, regardless of the fact that they didn't see service in Poland in 1939. Now, following the German invasion of the USSR in 1941, it was found the Panzer II was quickly becoming obsolete, and German forces were lacking the firepower to deal with Soviet tanks, such as the T-34 and the KV-1. Therefore, the Panzer II chassis served as the basis of several different self-propelled guns, including anti-tank guns, howitzers, and field artillery pieces. Now, one of the first of these was to take the Panzer off D and E tanks, build up the superstructure, and mount a captured Soviet 7.62 centimeter anti-tank gun in a sort of tall, awkward mounting on the top of the vehicle. Now, this resulted in a rather awkward-looking vehicle that was meant only as a stopgag measure. And this vehicle became known as the Marder II. Now, Marder is the German word for Martin, as in a small weasel, not a man's first name. Now, just to be confusing, the Germans made a second vehicle, also referred to as the Marder II, that was completely different from the vehicle we just described. Now, this vehicle featured a German-built 7.5 centimeter Pak 40 anti-tank gun on a Panzer II Offs A, B, C, or F hull. Now, this version, like the other Marder II design, was rather tall and lightly armored with an open fighting compartment. Both vehicles were considered stopgags until better designs came into service, being replaced by purpose-designed Jagdpanzers based on the Panzer 38 chassis that would come along a little later. In the Panzer I episode, we saw the first attempt by the Germans to mount their 15 centimeter infantry gun on a tank chassis. Now, by using the chassis of the Panzer II, which they stretched out a bit with a 6th road wheel to make it a little bigger, they were able to come up with a much more practical looking vehicle, at least, mounting that same rather humongous gun. Now, known as the 15 centimeter SIG 33 Offs Fahrgestell Panzerkampwagen II, this vehicle probably really could have used a nickname because it's not much fun to have to say that every time now. However, since only 12 of these were built, it probably didn't really matter. All 12 of these vehicles were shipped off to fight in North Africa, where it's found that the chassis was generally overloaded and the vehicles were mechanically unreliable. What is perhaps the most important of the Panzer II-based vehicles is the Leicht Fieldhaubitze 18-2 Offs Fahrgestell Panzerkampwagen II. Mercifully, this one did have a nickname, the Wespe, which means wasp. Now, this is the lower chassis of a Panzer II tank in which the engine has been moved to the center of the vehicle to create a fighting compartment at the rear to accommodate a 105 millimeter field gun. This gun was intended to provide mobile artillery for the German Panzer divisions, and it mounted the standard divisional light artillery field piece in German service at the time, the 10.5 centimeter LEFH-18. Now, this is generally considered to be a successful weapon system, although it didn't offer much crew protection, being open-topped, and that was a feature common to a lot of self-propelled artillery of the era, so it's not unique to the Wespe. Now, it was the last Panzer II-based vehicle to go into production or to stay in production, being produced from February of 1943 to June of 1944, with 676 being produced, as well as 159 additional versions that did not have a gun. They were used as ammo carriers to support the ones that did have guns. Now, finally, we should mention the Panzer II Flamm, F-L-A-M-M. Again, my German is terrible. Now, this is the flamethrower version of the Panzer II, and it was based on the Offs D and E hull. So for whatever reason, for the flamethrower version, they were using that version that was developed originally for the light divisions. This vehicle featured a turret armed with a single machine gun and 2 flamethrowers. Now, some of these were converted from existing Panzer II D and E tanks, but not many of those were made, so a lot of them were built from scratch. Oddly enough, with 155 of these vehicles produced total, more of them were made from scratch than were converted from the existing D&E tanks. Now, many of these flame tanks were converted into Marder II tank destroyers, since they proved not to be very successful in the tank flamethrower role due to their relatively thin armor. Flamethrower tanks have to get really close to the target, so armor is a very good thing to have on them. So generally, you'll see the most successful ones throughout the war tend to be heavier tanks, things like the Churchill, or the Germans would later convert some of the French Char B1 Bisses to be flamethrower tanks, because they've got armor, they can get close to the enemy. Light tank, not such a good idea. Now, the Panzer II was the second most numerous tank in German service during the invasion of Poland in 1939, being just slightly outnumbered by the Panzer I. Now, in this period, all German tanks were consolidated into either the Panzer divisions or the Light divisions. Now, the Light division was unique to the Polish campaign and found generally to be an unsuccessful concept. These units were upgraded to full Panzer division status prior to the invasion of France less than a year later. The Panzer division organization was not uniform in 1939, with 2 different divisional structures in place, and different divisions had different assortments of tanks based on what was available. So none of these divisions really were filled out the way that they should have been at that point, because they're still waiting for those Panzer IIIs and IVs. They're making do with all these light tanks. As we described in the episode on the Panzer I, the Panzer division did prove to be a decisive weapon during the invasion of Poland, as well as in France a year later. And while the Polish campaign of 1939 illustrated a number of small issues that needed to be addressed, overall the performance of the Panzer forces showed the great potential that the Panzer division possessed in conducting quick-moving combined arms operations, completely disrupting enemy forces, who were fighting based more on the World War I model of static and attritional warfare. Now, since the Panzer II was always regarded as a bit of a stopgag, it would become a smaller percentage of the German tank force throughout the war, being pretty much gone from frontline service by 1943 for sure, with a few exceptions. However, the self-propelled gun variants of the Panzer II would go on to serve until the end of the war, and the Os-L Luches, which was intended as a reconnaissance vehicle rather than as a frontline tank, would see service rather late in the war, actually, being encountered by the Allied forces during the Normandy campaign. As with many of the early war German tanks, the Panzer II enjoyed a successful combat record despite its rather unimpressive technical features. This tank remained in frontline service throughout the first 4 years of the war, seeing service in Poland, France, the USSR, and North Africa as a frontline tank, and this was more out of necessity than preference on the part of the Panzer Force. That said, it did have some good qualities. It was generally a reliable machine, and it was equipped with radios. Now, those features were essential for the rapid war of movement preferred by the German army in the first half of the war. Now, it's also these features, more than armor or gun power, that allowed the Panzers to overrun Poland and France. So in that regard, we can consider the Panzer II to be a successful combat vehicle. That said, 250 Panzer II tanks were knocked out during the Polish campaign, a sizable number considering the short duration of the fighting. It should be noted as well that the Panzer II comprised 38% of all tanks during the Polish campaign. In direct combat against Polish armor, the Panzer II would have had the upper hand against the most numerous Polish vehicle, which was the TK series of tankettes. Against the 7TP tank, though, it would have been at a definite disadvantage in gun power. And then also against the French R-35, which was in Polish service as well, it would have been at a real disadvantage in terms of armor protection. Now, that said, given the small number of tanks employed by the Poles, particularly of the R-35 and the 7TP, the greater danger to Panzer II crews were from anti-tank guns and anti-tank rifles. Our evaluation of the Panzer II is going to be pretty similar to the one we gave the Panzer I. Both were stopgag designs pressed into frontline service, while the Panzer forces awaited larger numbers of the Panzer III and IV tanks. Now, despite being poorly armed light tanks, together those two made up the majority of the German tank inventory at a time when the German army achieved its greatest successes. That said, the Panzer II could have been and probably should have been better than it was. By 1934, when it was designed, the question to arm the tank with a 20mm cannon designed for fighting aircraft was frankly a little questionable. By this period, Soviet tank designers were already putting their 45mm gun into their T-26 and BT series light tanks, and Czechoslovakia is producing light tanks armed with 37mm guns. And as we shall see, the Germans would go on to capture a good many of these Czech tanks in 1938 following the annexation of the Sudetenland and subsequent invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now, the Czech tanks would go on to fill an important gap in the German Panzer inventory, which, due to its reliance on the Panzer I and II, lacked tanks armed with a proper cannon. So in the final evaluation, we can say the Panzer II fulfilled the basic needs that the German army had at the time, which was something a little more substantial than a Panzer I. It was relatively reliable, it had radio, it could operate as part of a coordinated Panzer force, despite having really unimpressive combat characteristics in terms of firepower and armor. So generally a successful vehicle, and of course being relatively reliable made it the good basis for some later modifications to be used as a self-propelled gun and anything else that the Germans needed that would fit on that small of a chassis. Now, starting with this episode, we're going to also include a section at the end on books for further reading. These videos can only scratch the surface in a lot of ways. These vehicles, particularly when we get into some like the German vehicles, there's tons of variants, there's tons of combat history there. You can't cover everything in one video. You can't even come close. So if you want to learn more, here's some places I would suggest going to. For those looking for a quick overview of the Panzer II, as well as some of the other light tanks used by the Germans at the beginning of the war, there's the Osprey New Vanguard series. Number 26 of that series is German Light Panzers, 1932 to 1942, by Brian Parrott. So you can start there. Osprey also has another series called Duel, which is quite fun, and number 66 in that one is Panzer II versus 7TP by David Higgins. Now this one looks specifically at the Panzer II and the Polar 7TP, some of the cases where those tanks encountered each other. It's also got a lot of good background information on either vehicle, so that's also a good sort of starting point if you want to learn about some of these, so the Polish campaign in general as related to tanks. And Osprey titles, you can probably find them at your local hobby shop, carry them, sometimes some of the big box stores as well, and of course online. For those wanting to build a model kit of the Panzer II, Tankcraft 7, which is Panzer 1 and 2, is a nice resource for information about the vehicle, different model kits that are available, as well as lots of reference pictures and photos for whatever you want to build. So for the model builders, I would recommend that. And then for those who really want to go more in-depth and are willing to spend a little bit of dough, there is the English language edition of the Walter Spielberger book, Panzers 1 and 2 and their variants from Reichswehr to Wehrmacht. Now this one, you'll probably have to go to a specialized military bookseller or find it online, and it's going to cost you a chunk of change, but a much more detailed book. It's a big hardcover. And of course, also if you really want to dive into the minutiae, there's the Panzer Track series of softcover books. And there's 3 different volumes covering just the Panzer II. And we will list those all on our website, which will be linked in the video description. All right, well that wraps up this episode of the Tanks of World War II from Tank and AFV News. Again, my name's Tom. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, subscribe to us. Check out the website. If you really, really like it, you can go to our Patreon page and kick us a little donation, which that will all help us continue to do this. It's a lot of time, more time than you'd think to produce a video like this. I'm pretty much a one-man show. So in order to get me better equipment, better training, all that stuff, donations are cool. But if not, I appreciate people just watching and enjoying these because I like making them. I like talking about this stuff. So we hope that you will come back, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one.